Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating framework. It's called Living God Hermeneutics. The author here is totally challenging us to rethink how we approach the Bible, not just treating it like some closed, dusty historical record, but actually reading it as the active testimony of a God who is still acting today. And it all starts with this brilliant, kind of provocative question from the text. How do we interpret a book if we believe its central character is still alive? Seriously, think about that for a second. It challenges us to pause and ask whether our interpretive methods actually match our theology. If the central figure is literally alive and active, the author argues our reading should absolutely reflect that reality. So, to wrap our heads around this framework, we'll walk through the author's argument in 6 quick steps: the myth of neutrality, the spectrum of cessationism, defining God's power, prophecy, and sovereign oversight, avoiding too dangerous extremes, and finally, reverent supernatural realism. All right, part 1, the myth of neutrality. The idea here is that every single interpreter brings prior convictions to the table. The author's baseline premise is that, honestly, no interpretation is ever religiously neutral. Before you even crack the spine of a book, you're bringing your own prior convictions into it. Take 2 interpreters reading the exact same healing narrative. They are going to ask completely different questions. Someone assuming an open, supernatural system will ask, well, what does this reveal about God's power today? Meanwhile, someone assuming a closed system will immediately look for reasons why that event was a one-off, unique, non-repeatable thing. The text points out that expecting less supernatural activity doesn't actually make you more objective. You're still just reading through a very specific lens. And this creates a fundamental shift in perspective. If we reduce God to just a passive object of study, well, the Bible basically becomes a religious encyclopedia, right? But if God is recognized as the speaking and acting subject, capital S, reading transforms into an active encounter with his authority. Which brings us to part 2, the spectrum of cessationism and the nuances in those theological positions. The source is incredibly careful here to distinguish between outright anti-supernaturalism and the specific nuances of cessationist theology. It's a whole spectrum. On one far end, you have naturalistic interpretation ruling out the supernatural entirely. On the other end, continuationism fully expects it. But right in the middle, you've got these various forms of cessationism. The author proves it would be totally unfair to accuse every cessationist of denying a living God. However, they do highlight a major contradiction with what they call practical cessationism. That's where miracles are affirmed on paper, theoretically, but almost never expected in actual reality. Because of this, the author argues we need a massive shift in our core question. Instead of asking this binary, must God repeat every single historical miracle today, we should really be asking, according to Scripture, what has God actually promised, commanded, or patterned? Moving right along to section 3, defining God's power and the proper order of operations. The author issues a really strong warning here against building a philosophical fence around God based purely on our own human limitations. Instead, they outline a strict, non-negotiable order of operations. Step 1, Scripture itself has to dictate our doctrine. Step 2, that doctrine shapes our view of God. And only then, step 3, does that doctrine dictate our expectations and practice. So why does this order matter so much? Well, when the flow is healthy, the text drives our expectations. But the author warns against a super dangerous reversal, allowing your own personal lack of supernatural experience to restrict your expectations. If you do that, you end up retroactively forcing a reinterpretation of Scripture just to fit your lack of experience. Ultimately, the argument is that both our experiences and our non-experiences have to submit to the text. Let's look at section 4, prophecy and sovereign oversight. This is about moving way beyond mere foreknowledge. A living God hermeneutic requires us to view predictive texts as far more than just lucky guesses or a crystal ball. Predictive prophecy actually relies on 3 core actions. God knows the future beyond just present possibilities, he declares his purpose ahead of time, and most importantly, he actively governs history. The God who makes a promise remains actively, providentially directing history toward his appointed end the entire time between the prediction and the fulfillment. And where does this whole thing lead? The source stresses that a truly God-honoring interpretation isn't just going to produce a fascination with miracles or a neat timeline of prophecy. Instead, it reveals how all fulfillment is centered squarely on exalting Jesus Christ. The entire redemptive story, the whole shebang, according to the text, points directly to him. All right, section 5, avoiding too dangerous extremes and finding that crucial middle ground. The text issues a really strict warning to avoid two specific dialectical traps. The first is what they call skeptical reduction. This treats prophecy as impossible and functionally makes God absent from your methodology. The second trap is the complete opposite, sensational expansion. This is where people assign divine authority to untested impressions, meaning their personal experience ends up controlling the text's meaning. One makes God absent, while the other makes him this predictable tool for human agendas. And honestly, the author argues neither of those truly honors a sovereign God. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Reverent Supernatural Realism. This is the synthesis and application of everything we've talked about. To bridge that massive gap between those two dangerous extremes we just looked at, the author proposes a balanced posture called Reverent Supernatural Realism. This framework holds tightly to the reality of the supernatural, fully acknowledging that God is living and free to act extraordinarily. But at the same time, it remains deeply, deeply humble. It demands that our experiences be tested, it recognizes that our interpretations are totally fallible, and it remembers that every interpreter is accountable. The absolute crucial takeaway here is how this framework views the text itself. Yes, the Bible is historically situated. Obviously, it was written in a very specific time and place. But as the author states, its authority is not imprisoned in history. Because the living God is directly addressing the present reader, the enduring truth of his word basically leaps out of its ancient context directly into our modern reality. So how do we actually apply this day to day? To prevent Scripture from just becoming some dry archaeological artifact on one hand, or a container for our own subjective impressions on the other, the interpreter has to deliberately walk through three necessary stages. First, you determine the historical meaning. Second, you extract the enduring theological truth. And third, you identify the present divine claim on our lives today. You literally need all three for this to work. And honestly, this brings a pretty heavy weight to the task. The author soberly reminds us that biblical interpretation is a morally accountable act. We are not detached judges standing high above the text, just casually analyzing it. Rather, the text stands in judgment over us. To maintain that level of humility, the text provides this awesome sort of self-audit checklist for serious interpreters. Ask yourself, what does the text actually say? What does it reveal about God's character? Am I limiting the text just because of something I haven't personally experienced? Or, on the flip side, am I expanding the text because of a crazy experience I did have? It's a vital checklist to make absolutely sure we're honoring both God's freedom to act and his faithfulness to his word. Ultimately, the source concludes with this incredibly simple yet powerful statement: the God who spoke this word is alive. The core argument here is that any interpretive system that treats the Bible's author as merely a character confined to ancient history is just fundamentally inadequate to the claims the scripture actually makes about itself. And this leaves us with the author's final, super challenging thought. It's a question that really forces us to examine our own hearts, our biases, and our methods whenever we crack open the text. Whatever interpretation you arrive at, can you defend it before a living God with humility and integrity? It is a profound thought to take away from this explainer, and definitely one that challenges how we engage with the text moving forward.